So I thought I'd talk about some of the products that I've gotten so far and my current thoughts on them. So you're probably aware that in some of the past videos I got like a USB hub and I've gotten some other adapters too. Like just USB, HDMI adapters, etc. And when I got each of these things, I was a little bit hesitant to, because it seemed like they all had some sort of problem like you see in the reviews, of course. Like overall it's a good product, but it had these little minor issues that I was concerned about dealing with, and I basically took a gamble with getting these adapters. For that reason, I would like to share my experience with these adapters. So if you need to get these kind of adapters, I want to share what my personal experience is with those adapters so that hopefully if you are taking a gamble as well, you have a better idea of what you're getting into. So the link to all the things I'm going to share in the description in the order that I'm sharing them in here. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was the Mirabox capture card. It's a capture card that's $60 and I got it mainly just to have another capture card for this camcorder. But the Camlink, which I've talked about before, doesn't support 1080p 60. Well, it supports 1080p 60, it doesn't support 1080i 60. With a 1080i 60 source, it ends up becoming 1080p 29.97, I think. And it's got horrible interlacing. Even with the interlacing in OBS, it looks horrible. But the Mirabox, I got that to hopefully handle interlacing better, since pretty much no other capture card that I've looked at, as far as I can tell, supports 1080i 60. Maybe some of them do, but they're not advertising that very well. But I saw Box YouTube channel review the Mirabox, and he said that it supports 1080i 60 and it comes de-interlaced as it is. I think it becomes de-interlaced before it even becomes an input source through the card. It does support 1080p. That's, I think, the only resolution it supports. It actually does support other resolutions, but it downscales to 1080p from my understanding. And since I record everything in 1080p, that's perfect. So even if I have like a 4K device, it will downscale to 1080p, I think. So I haven't actually tried it with a 4K device. I don't know if it'll have a 4K resolution or if it actually forces the device to use 1080p. But for purposes like a 1080i source, the Mirabox does an excellent job at that. Like what you're seeing right here is the result of the Mirabox, and it supports YUI2, which I would recommend making sure that mode is selected if you're capturing that, which is like basically an uncompressed HDMI stream, because you don't want the stream with HDMI itself to be compressed. And YUI2 ensures that it's uncompressed versus MJPEG. So it supports YUI2, which you don't see in too many capture cards that are under $100. The Camlink 4K does too, by the way. But yeah, if you're just looking to record 1080p sources, the Mirabox, I think, does a great job. At first, it was like $120, which wasn't really worth it, like 120 USD dollars. But I got mine for 60. So assuming that it is still that kind of price, I would say it's definitely worth it for 1080p sources, especially if you want 1080i and the interlacing to happen automatically. As you can see, there's no interlacing right here. That's the green screen motion, what you're seeing, but that's not from interlacing. It supports 1080p 60 as well, of course, I think. I mainly just used it with this camera, but I like it so far. So if you have a 1080i 60 camera, the Mirabox might be a good choice for that. That's what I primarily use it for. I haven't used it with my computer or anything, but I assume it would work just as well for that. Watch Box's review on that, because he goes into it in pretty good depth. So, even with his review, there were some things I was a little uncertain about. Like, would it work with this camera properly in the way I want and stuff? Yes, it does. So, what issue I have noticed is it would randomly sort of kick out. But I think refreshing the OBS source made it work again. Or unplugging the USB and plugging it back in would fix it as well. But I've only experienced that a couple times, and that primarily happened when I think it got real warm. So I actually had it on top of my Intel NUC, which I think the heat compounded and it got to like almost 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Maybe even closer to 110 or 120. So it can get warm, but when I don't have it on top of the Intel NUC, then it actually gets to be about 80 to 90 Celsius, so it's not bad at all. It's about the same as what the Camlink does on average. I'll check it right now if you guys are curious. If I can easily reach it. I'd say that's about 100 Fahrenheit. I'm just taking a guess, because I felt various devices and took their temperatures. But I think that's about 100 Fahrenheit. It doesn't really become a problem until it gets to like 150 Fahrenheit, I think. But it can get a little bit warm, but Camlink does that too, so if you could like minimize the heat sources, like don't have it on top of like an Intel NUC, for example, which on the top of that is warm and then it compounds. If you have it in an area that's like not too warm, and you don't directly have it on another warm surface, then it should just get to like 90, 100 Fahrenheit on average, which isn't nearly that problematic. Heat shouldn't really be that much of a concern. That was one of my initial concerns, but in my experience, it's been pretty good. So that's my thoughts on the Mirabox and sort of how I use it and stuff. So now let's talk about that 4-port USB hub that I've shown in a previous casual video. So that's an Anchor, and I think it works pretty good overall, but I've run into problems where if the power draw is more than what a USB port provides, that can be problematic since there's no external power brick with that one. So if you use a lot of power USB devices, this one wouldn't be a good choice. You're better off with one that has an external power brick, since each USB port provides a limited amount of power, and that one USB port's worth of power is distributed across all 4 ports. So unless you're using a USB port that outputs more power, or you have that connected to Thunderbolt via an adapter such as this one, which I will be reviewing in a second, then you'll get more power with those types of things. But for things that don't have a lot of power draw, it works amazing. So if you're having reliability issues with that hub, it's probably because there's too much power draw or too much bandwidth usage. But power draw is more likely the limitation that's going to end up happening. So I usually use it for things like the keyboard and mouse receiver, my Steam controller receiver, which hardly takes any power at all, 3.5 millimeter USB adapter. Those hardly draw any power, and it works amazing for those devices. Now, if I'm doing it for like an external hard drive, a mechanical one, that's probably going to draw too much power. I mean, you probably can use it, but then you can't use anything else with it because the power draw will probably be to a max. So if you need more power, get one with an external brick. Oftentimes I wish that I did that, but I use it for things that don't draw all that much power, and it works pretty great for that. So keep that in mind if you're gonna get a hub like this. Do things with minimal power like a keyboard and mouse receiver, and maybe some other receivers that don't really draw much power at all. Now, like hooking up your phone to it, that's gonna almost certainly draw too much power. That's where you want one of those external power brick ones. The cord is kind of short, but I use it with the adapter that I've always used anyway. That works pretty well for me. So you might need like a USB extension in your situation, but with a USB extension it works pretty well. So keep that in mind. You might end up using a USB extension unless you can somehow get away with the very short length that it has. I think it's like less than a foot possibly. I don't know. So keep that in mind if you're getting a USB hub like this. So did I cover everything? I think that is pretty much everything I can think of regarding that USB hub. So those are my thoughts on using it. I don't use it with things that draw a lot of power. I'm using one port's worth of power. And for receivers, usually that works pretty well. So yeah, if you're having reliability issues, then yeah, consider the fact that you may want to use devices with less power on that. Or else get one that has a power brick, which I know feels kind of inconvenient, but there is a reason for that. USB devices can draw a lot of power and it is absolutely necessary. But for low power devices, it should be enough if the USB port can provide enough power for that. I've been able to hook up an SSD to it with a SATA to USB adapter, because this doesn't draw too much power as far as I can tell. So yeah, just low power draw. If you're just doing things that have low power draw, like a mouse and keyboard receiver and things like that, then it should work pretty well. But if you're gonna hook up phone to it, which USB ports usually don't provide enough power on the computer to do a fast charge anyway, so your phone will max it out if that is the case. But if you have a USB port that provides more power, like a charging port specifically on the computer, then that'll work pretty well, I think. I have to experiment with that. So those are things to keep in mind with this adapter. Generally works with lower power stuff. There's something else I was going to mention too, I think, but I can't really think of it right now. Oh, I think the webcam seems to work with it. If I hook up a webcam, as long as it doesn't have too much power. But keep in mind that if the power is on the verge of being too much, the webcam may keep dropping out and coming back unreliably. So that's what I was going to say. So you do have a risk of too much power being drawn, which will cause some devices to become unreliable, such as the keyboard and mouse or webcam or anything like that. That only happens if too much power is being drawn at once. But keep that in mind. So if you're hooking up devices and you care about reliability and you don't want the power to be dropping out and stuff, then I would probably avoid this. Use something that's got external power or something like that. If you care about a device being reliable, for example, I don't have this camera hooked up, so I don't have the Mirabox hooked up to that USB hub, because it probably would work, but I'm a little worried about a lack of reliability with power. Even if it works right away, 10 minutes later, it might start randomly dropping out, for example, because of too much power draw. So I'm not taking my chances with the Mirabox, for example. But for low power things like receivers, I think it works great for that. Or things that just don't really draw power. So if I hook up my voice recorder, for example, it doesn't actually really draw any power over USB. It just transfers data. So that won't be problematic either because it doesn't really draw any power over USB. It's just for data transfer. So for things like voice recorders that are battery powered, those will work great too. I think I've covered pretty much everything I'm going to with that USB hub. So yeah, the main problem is power draw, which is a limitation of USB itself and not the adapter necessarily. That's why you get a power brick. But without one, low power things should work just fine. I typically use it for keyboard and mouse receiver, the audio adapter, so I could hook up my headphones to it. And sometimes another receiver for like the Steam controller. I often hook up a micro SD card adapter or the voice recorder and stuff. It works great for those things, honestly. And again, a power draw is a problem. You can probably get around that if you have a card or you have a USB port that draws more power or provides more power. So that's what you're really running up against. How much power does the original USB port provide for all 4 ports on the adapter? So hopefully that should be enough for you to decide if that product is worth the gamble or not. I've never had it for any devices or anything like that. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about that. So the 3.5mm audio adapters, I did an unboxing in one of the past casual videos, so I will quickly review this too. There's a little bit of increased latency compared to built-in ports on the computer, but that's probably not that big of a deal because usually USB cameras and stuff, whether it's through a capture card or a webcam, will also have that latency as well. Not just this. USB is probably to blame for that latency. That's my only thing that I've really noticed with that. But as far as like the headphone port goes, it works just like any other headphone port. I don't notice any latency. But for the microphone, that's what I was just talking about. For the microphone, that's where latency is a little bit higher than a built-in port. But you're probably not even going to notice that on a video. In fact, this video is using one of these USB adapters right now. I'm using that for my microphone. Do you notice any latency with that? If not, then I would definitely recommend this USB adapter, which should be in the description. It's pretty much all there is to it. They're quite handy to have. If you have multiple of them, you will have to make sure you can identify which one you're using at a given time. So in OBS, there will be multiple devices listed. You just make sure you select the right one. The other thing that's worth noting is the default volume in Windows, and I think Mac too, tends to be around 72%. So you may have to go into the audio settings and increase that to 100. So that might actually be the operating system's fault and not the adapter, but you can bring it up to 100 and it works fine. That's honestly all I have to say about it. It works pretty great and it's quite handy. So that's pretty much all there is to these adapters. I have multiple of them now because of how handy they are. It's a thing that allowed me to switch my microphone audio from analog to semi-digital. Because I think these ports are still analog if I'm not mistaken. But it's a lot more digital than I used to be. And with the USB extension cable, these are really handy. If you have a USB extension cable, and you want to have wired audio that goes pretty far away, like this for example. So I could be all the way over here, which is 6 feet away or so. It works just as well with a USB extension cable. So yeah, very handy. So I'm going to move on to the next thing, since that's pretty much all I have to say about that. So the other thing I was going to show is another USB hub that I got that's got a Thunderbolt end to it. So this is another USB hub with Thunderbolt natively on the end. This works just like you'd expect as well. Since Thunderbolt typically provides more power than USB-A, this is less likely to run into power issues than the other adapter that I previously talked about. But if you get an adapter to convert this to USB-A, you're still going to run against the power limitations of USB-A. So keep that in mind. But Thunderbolt provides quite a bit more power, and even with external hard drives that are mechanical and webcams and things like that, it works well with all those things at once. So yeah, the only thing I've noticed about this is if I use any of my capture cards with it, even the analog one, it doesn't seem to pick up the input for some reason. The other USB hub does, but this one doesn't for some reason, so none of my capture cards work with that USB hub. I don't know why. I have like 3 different capture cards and none of them work with it, so it might have a limitation for some of the data that could sort of go through it. But otherwise, for the most part, it works great. It works with the webcam just fine, which is interesting, but the capture cards, not really. So other than that, I like it. That's pretty much all I have to say about that one too. So I got this adapter as well, which is a USB-C to A. It would allow me to hook up like a flash drive to my phone if I wanted to. Or pretty much anything I want to do actually. You convert pretty much any Thunderbolt to USB-A. This is an anchor as well. And once again, the power draw is the weakest link in the chain, as with anything. And this works pretty well. Doesn't heat up very much at all. So, and this doesn't heat up a whole lot either, by the way. It's honestly nothing much to say. It just works as far as I can tell. I've used it on a Mac when I was trying to boot stuff. I hooked up a SSD to it. Worked great. So not a whole lot to say about that. So this HDMI to Thunderbolts, I like these, and I have multiple of these as well. I'm using one for one of my displays right now, and it's working pretty great. I've actually had some reliability issues with a Thunderbolt dock, and using this as a standalone is far more reliable than a whole Thunderbolt dock. And the Thunderbolt dock is a limitation just because it's like a 9 or 14 in 1, and that's just bound to happen with all those ports and the way it's getting used. But as a standalone, where only HDMI is used, I find that very reliable. This heats up just like you would typically expect, maybe 90 Fahrenheit if you're doing 1080p, but if you're doing 4K, there's a chance that it might overheat. So I really don't think that any device is designed to properly cool a 4K adapter. So 4K 60, I just don't recommend with devices like this because it's just not designed to cool that. And mind you, this gets to like 90 or 100 Fahrenheit with just 1080p, so as you quadruple that, it can get to overheating point. So if you see a lot of failures in the reviews and stuff, it's almost certainly because people use 4K and it overheated with that. But if you blow a fan on this or something, properly cool it down, then I think it should be fine with 4K. But keep in mind that these just, I don't personally think that there's any device that can properly cool HDMI adapters using 4K 60 Hz, possibly even 30 Hz. So keep that in mind. A lot of them fail because of overheating with 4K, I think. But if you're just using 1080p like I do, not a worry at all. As far as I can tell, 90-ish is about the warmest it gets. 150 is around where you'd probably be concerned about overheating. 90 Fahrenheit, no big deal at all. So that's pretty much all there is to that one. So now I may as well review this Ethernet one that I recently got. Looks a lot like the USB one, but it's got Ethernet on the end. I was concerned about the overheating when I first got this, but it's not much of a problem from what I can tell. Even when I was actively transferring many things at gigabit speed, like hundreds of gigabytes worth of stuff, it didn't get super warm. It got to the typical temperature range even with that. And as far as I can tell, it doesn't really require drivers either. It seems to be just plug and play for the most part. There might be some places where it needs drivers, but in my experience, it often doesn't. So for example, if I'm using VMware's ESXi, which is a Type 1 hypervisor, it might not work with a lot of Intel adapters or Intel network interfaces, for example. But I find that it works with this right out of the box. So if you're using like ESXi, for example, on a device that's got a Thunderbolt port, and your Ethernet doesn't work and you don't want to worry about, what's the term for the enhanced drivers, which you typically would want to use in a business setting, this might be worth looking into if you have a Thunderbolt port. It seems to work natively with ESXi, which is pretty interesting. Otherwise, it works just like a typical Ethernet port. It should just show up in Windows. I think it works on Mac as well. And Linux, I don't think I've tried it in Linux, but I'm sure it would work with that too. So if it works with ESXi, I imagine it would work in Linux. I don't know. So if you're thinking of getting an Ethernet adapter and you don't want to have to worry about like overheating and stuff, I've had pretty good experiences with that adapter personally. So now I want to talk about a USB flash drive. So I got a 256 gig USB flash drive right here. And I was concerned, it's a Sandisk Extreme Pro. I was kind of like concerned about reliability and like overheating and stuff like that. But I find that it tends to be in the typical temperature range as well. Maybe 90, 100 Fahrenheit. I think as long as you have it in an area where it's not like being directly exposed to heat exhaust or anything, it should be fine as far as heat goes. And the 256 gig drive appears to really have a 256 gig capacity. I pretty much maxed it out and it was able to hold everything as far as I could tell. No corruption. And it seems to get like 300 megabytes per second on average, maybe. There are times when it might go beyond that. But honestly, this is like faster than any flash drive I've ever really used before. So I like using this as a Ventoy drive and I think it works great for that. I actually got a second one just for backup. I have them both exactly the same since I previously stored stuff on my secondary PC. I wanted to free up some space, so I got another flash drive so I could have a backup of the flash drive itself. They're pretty reasonably priced, I think, especially for the reliability and all the things you get with this. I think it's a lifetime warranty if I remember correctly. And I've had great experiences with it so far. It's the fastest flash drive I've ever used. And it seems to really have space and stuff like that. Heating's not really an issue. So, any of those things were a concern to you, shouldn't be a problem. So I would definitely recommend the drive. It could go up to 1 terabyte. I don't know if it really holds a terabyte, but 256 gig works pretty well for me. So, yeah. I think it's a great Ventoy drive. If you have a bunch of ISOs that you want to store utilities, especially as an IT professional, I think it's great for that. So I would definitely recommend that. So I real quickly wanted to talk about the Samsung 870 EVO drive, because one of my concerns about buying this was whether or not things would support 4096 byte sectors on the hard drive, while traditionally 512 byte sectors are used. I think some people were having problems with that from what I read. I was concerned about whether that would be problematic or not. But in my experience, the 870 EVO tends to be 512 byte sectors, even though it's like advertised for 4096, I think. I can't remember for sure how that is, but I tend to have 4096 byte sectors. So the main thing with the EVO drive is mine does 512 byte sectors. The other thing I was going to mention regarding the 4096 byte sector stuff is whether or not you'll be able to handle it is software based rather than hardware based. I was like, is my SATA port going to handle 4096 bytes? Well, that's entirely software based. So whether or not you'll be able to support it should depend on whether or not your operating system supports it. If you have an operating system that doesn't support it, then it might be a problem. Otherwise, it shouldn't be. It's a matter of whether your operating system supports it. Windows 10 should. Linux, I would think, would too. So, all those concerns I had about the drive, they're not concerns. Should we get a new drive? I would recommend it. So yeah. So now regarding my splitter, I don't have that right here, but there should be a link for that in the description. The HDMI 2-in-1 splitter. I've had good experiences with it so far. I mean, one time there was an HDMI cable that just kept sliding out easily, but it was specifically that cable causing the problem. And with a different cable, I'm not experiencing that. So you do have to provide external power. Pretty much any USB port, even if it provides a low amount of power, seems to work with it just fine. So if you're concerned about whether the HDMI splitter will do a good job with like 1080p, for example, if you're trying to get Camlink 4K to force 1080p, I think it does a really good job with that. So if you're doing that sort of thing, this is a good one for that. In fact, my screen right here is actually going through that splitter that I'm talking about, and it works pretty well. So if you're trying to find a splitter for the sake of forcing the Camlink 4K to go to 1080p, this one's a good one. That's pretty much all I have to say about that. One thing I should quickly note when using the Camlink 4K with the splitter in OBS is there are some situations, like if the screen resolution changes or I change the HDMI source, where the source will freeze up. To fix it, I have to deactivate the OBS source, unplug the Camlink and the HDMI from it. After a few seconds, plug the Camlink back in and activate the OBS source. If the rectangle to resize it appears after activating, I can plug the HDMI back into it and it'll work again. If not, I need to repeat that until it works. A little bit convoluted, but if the OBS source freezes up while using the splitter in the Camlink 4K, this fixes it for me every time.